everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Trust Talk of 2021. We are so excited to be with you this evening. Trust Talks is a monthly virtual program hosted by the Decorative Arts Trust, where we pair emerging scholars with more senior professionals within the field to share new and exciting scholarship live. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and want to see more of the programs that we are hosting at the Trust, go ahead and check out our website. Everything that we do at the Trust is because of your participation and support. So we are so grateful that you are here. Without any further ado, I am excited to introduce Angelik Vizcarrondo-Laboy. She currently serves as the assistant curator at the Museum of Arts and Design. She's been at MAD for 6 years, and during her time there, she has been incredibly busy working on over 20 different exhibitions that are an incredible body of work. And we are so excited to share her exhibition today, Sleight of Hand. After Angelik presents, she will be joined by Garth John, curator of the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York. And we are thrilled to share that conversation as well. So without further ado, Angelik, take it away.
Thanks, Carrie. And thanks to the Decorative Arts Trust for the invitation. And thank you to Garth, who will be joining me later. Really loving that pink wall behind you. And thank you to everyone who came today. I hope that this talk will be a little bit of a respite from everything that's going on in our country. And I also wanted to note that events like what happened yesterday is the reason why many of the artists that I'm going to talk about make the work they make. So it's pretty relevant. I'm going to share my PowerPoint now. Oops. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. So like Carrie said, my presentation is just titled after the exhibition that is based on, which is Sleight of Hand, which is an exhibition I got to curate as part of my fellowship with the Center for Craft in Asheville. The show is still up till January 22nd, so if you find your way there somehow, I would love for you to go check it out in person. And the show is about, well, like this says, it's about humor in ceramics. So it brings together 6 contemporary artists who are working in clay, who use humor as a powerful tool of resistance, resilience, and healing to navigate a range of pressing social issues and political issues. So anything from gender, race, ethnicity, immigration status, things like that. And what's important about it, I think, it's that they're using humor in a subversive way. So they're using humor in their work as this sort of, it's a facade. There's a certain, and that's kind of why I decided to, on this title, Sleight of Hand. So this idea of an illusion. So there's a facade to the work, to the surfaces that are being presented, but deep down, there's a lot more serious and darker undertones to the work that is being presented. And I wanted to, so this is a show. This is just an installation image. It's a very intimate scale, so you can kind of glimpse it all at once. And more on the subversiveness, humor serves as sort of like the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. I think it's a pretty simple metaphor to understand that way. Or it can be a Trojan horse. So it helps break down defensive walls that can come up when discussing sort of either taboo or just difficult to talk about subjects that just might make some people tense. You know, when you talk politics, especially, there tends to be a lot of tension. So that's what these artists are doing. They're using humor as a way to sort of infiltrate and make their way past those walls. So I'll keep on going here. But I wanted to also, actually, let me go back here. I wanted to say that for me, humor it's sort of like this very expansive umbrella that many things fall under it. So that is anything from irony, absurdity, something that's quirky, something that's eccentric, anthropomorphism, cuteness. So there's a lot of things for me that fall under the umbrella of humor. And I think you should never expect to just sort of be like belly laughing when you see this work. It's a little more nuanced than that. And I think it's also important to note how challenging humor can be in something like a sculpture. I think humor, for the most part, is successful in a performative way, so in an active way, because you're waiting for that punchline. There's sort of this moving target. But these artists are able to capture humor without that. And so to the left of the show, like when you turn the corner, there's this section that looks as sort of where my inspiration came from for the show, and that is funk ceramics. And I understand that many people might not know what funk ceramics are. It could be described as maybe a little obscure and sort of like a very quirky part of funk, the history of ceramics in the United States. And so what happened is that maybe late 50s, 60s, there's this group of artists who were making very sort of experimental work, mostly in the Bay Area, but it was happening kind of all over the place. It was very anti-establishment art. And I don't mean anti-establishment as in anti-government, but anti what the rules of the art world were at the time. So it was work that was in a sense unclassifiable. Nobody knew what to make of it. It was amorphous and sometimes ugly, and it just had all these materials. It also, I will note, although I'm focusing on ceramics, funk art included everything. There was paintings, there was mixed media sculpture, there's all types of things. But basically it was this sort of category that nobody could actually categorize. So I think up to this day, nobody can quite agree on what funk art is or was, or who was making it, or everybody has different opinions on it. And I think that's what makes it really interesting. And I will also say, it's just elusive. But what I wanted to do was connect the past and the present, because I realized that there was a lot of what was going on in the past, those aesthetics were being brought up by contemporary artists now. And part of that includes the humor. And so this image right here is the cover of a catalog from a 1967 exhibition called Funk, curated by Peter Sells, who was a curator at MoMA who moved to California to become the founding director of the Berkeley Art Museum. And while he was there, he decided, oh, let me curate this show called Funk, in which he brought together a bunch of artists from the Bay Area who were making funk art. The funny thing, though, is that most of the artists in the show were really not appreciative of the term. They were really reluctant to be known as funk artists, and which is ironic because a lot of them were also using the word themselves, and they had been using the word for at least 5 years to describe their own work. And they were referencing, for example, funk as in funk music, their sort of improvisational, experimental quality of funk, but also funk as in like body odor, like, ooh, that's funky, which is, you could kind of put that together with how when people describe funk art as being ugly, it's sort of this something that you just don't know what it is. And so this show happened, there was a symposium, and it's funny, this show only lasted a month, and it caused such like a ripple effect. But there was a symposium, and the artists that came were basically just berating the curator the whole time on why he did this show and like why he was trying to like box them into this category. Because again, they were really reluctant to it. But one artist that was not reluctant was Robert Arneson. He was actually really into it. He was one of those artists who was using the word funk to describe his own work. About 4 years before the show, which was 1967, 1963, he was creating toilets out of clay, and he was calling them Funk John. Just so he was very embracive of that word. But these two works that are here, Lover, which is this rotary telephone, and then Typewriter, were part of that exhibition, the 1967 exhibition, even though these works were made in 1965. And as you can see, he was just taking everyday objects and making them into these very surrealist and kitschy, sometimes vulgar artworks. And I'll say here. But I wanted to bring up Peter Volkas, because Peter Volkas was actually also part of that exhibition. And when I think of funk ceramics, Peter Volkas would never, ever come to mind. But I mean, of course, Peter Volkas is super important to where we are with contemporary ceramics. He, of course, you know, as was Arneson, they were both trained as potters. They were making these sort of perfect pots, and at some point they were like, you know what, we're not gonna do that anymore. And so Peter is very important for that. And Arneson tried to do something like in the more abstract realm as Peter was doing, but ultimately ended up making this kind of work, which nobody really was making, this sort of figurative, like something recognizable, but turning it on its head and making it shocking in a sense. Robert was a provocateur. Until the day he died, he enjoyed causing shock. I'm gonna go back here. I wanted to say the reason why I bring Peter Volkas up too is that the only real connecting thread between the work in that show was that everybody was from the Bay Area. But there was also other artists in the Bay Area who were making funk work that weren't included in the show, such as Viola Fry and Clayton Bailey. David Gilhooly was an exception. He was also part of the show, and he was actually Arneson's student. Arneson was a professor at UC Davis, where he was really influential. But there was also other artists who were not even in the Bay Area who were making work that falls under this sort of funk umbrella, such as Howard Cutler and Pattie Warashina, who were in Washington State. Going back to Robert Arneson, for many is the father of funk. So even though you had ceramics of very different ceramics in that 1967 funk exhibition, it was Arneson that became the marquee for funk. If you think funk ceramics, Arneson is it. That's where your mind's gonna go, and it just kind of flows from there. And I wanted to show these two images because Arneson eventually becomes just kind of obsessed with self-portraits. That's what he ends up doing for the rest of his career, all the way until his passing in the 90s. And the one on the left is in Matt's collection. And actually that bust was a very sort of normal portrait of himself. And when he finished it, he didn't like it. He thought it was boring. And so he went ahead and just broke it and reglazed it and added these marbles. It's called Artist Losing His Marbles. And then the one on the right is called Hallowed Gesture. And this is very typical of what you can expect of Arneson. It's these self-portraits that are sort of very self-deprecating. He's always in some type of like abuse, either physical or psychological. Something's always going on with him. And that's kind of, and everybody really recognizes him for that. Again, like I said, he was a professor at UC Davis, where he was really influential to a group of students who became funk artists by proxy. They weren't necessarily included in the show, but because they were sort of very close with Arneson, they started making work that resembled that had that aesthetic, and became known for that. And they did this at the Candy Store Gallery. It's sort of this legendary gallery in California. This is Arneson's work, and you can see he painted a little image of the candy store in his sunglasses. And he says, well, fancy seeing you here at the Candy Store Gallery. It was sort of their hub to hang out and make art and show art. And they actually got together and decided to kind of rename the group as Nut Art. Like they made nut art as opposed to funk art, which makes sense in a sense that a lot of people call funk a movement. I personally don't think it is a movement because, again, nobody could agree. There was no defined group of artists. It was just sort of too loose to be a movement. On the other hand, Nut art had sort of a very specific group, very specific ideas, and they were creating work that was humorous and very personal in nature. Here you have, this is actually a picture of the inside of the gallery. You have Arneson in the very center back and David Gilhooly I'm gonna say to the right, and then Peter van der Rohe at the bottom, Maya Peoples-Bright on the very bottom corner left, Roy DeForest on the top left, and then the owner of the gallery is the one sitting down. It's a very sort of influential gallery as well. And this is this is contemporary image of Parker Gallery here in LA. They did this exhibition that brought together all the work from the Candy Store Gallery. So I would imagine that this is what an exhibition there would have looked like at the time by Nut artists. And so what I wanted to do was connect the past and the present, because I really think that if you were to take this work from 50 years ago and the work that is in Sleight of Hand, and you were to put it together in one room, you would have a hard time knowing what's from the past and what's from the present. And it's something that I look forward to doing eventually in 2023. MAD is we're supposed to put on a show in which you will get to see that happen. But for now, I decided to focus on a sort of a slice of the pie. And so the actual works that are in the show, again, are all contemporary work, and more specifically, they're works by artists of color. And why is that? And the reason why I did that is because this show, Sleight of Hand, is actually partly a critique of that original cohort, which was mostly white and mostly male. And I think the ceramics field has luckily evolved significantly. And I wanted to show that by narrowing in and sharing the very unique and important lens of artists of color, which is something that's very important for my practice. I think also what's important is that the way that humor was being used in the past only sort of merely scratched the surface of the potential for humor in ceramics. And I think that's also part of the evolution. I think this younger generation has really mined that power in the work that they're making nowadays. And so I'll start here with Natalia Arbelaez, who is a Colombian-American artist based in New York. And she, excuse me, she makes these sculptures. This is very sort of typical of her work. Like if you see this, you know it's hers. This is from her Mestizo series. This is also in Matt's collection. And she's using both materials and narrative to convey her point. And she's very interested in Amerindian identity, sort of the connection between sort of identity today as affected by colonization in the past. And so the orange clay, that's terracotta, so it's something that would have been used by her indigenous ancestors to make pottery. But then she's using maiolica, which is this thick white glaze that was invented in Europe to imitate porcelain, to cover this other figure who is clearly a representation of the colonizer. And she's sort of reeling with the idea of trying to track lineages down, which of course, when you are POC, BIPOC, you usually have a harder time tracking down sort of your history, because either through genocide, immigration, colonization, things like that, it's very hard to sort of have a clear path back, tracing back to the past. But she's using sort of this technique that's very, very her to actually do an homage to Pattie Warashina, who I mentioned before, who was in Washington State, sort of making funk art at the same time as like Arneson and Co. Natalia, part of her practice, something that's really important to her, is doing research into ceramicists of color that are women. And so when she was at MAD doing a residency, she asked me, hey, can you get me a list of the women ceramicists of color in the collection, and I did. Warashina was one of them. And so she made this work as an homage, but it's a celebration of Warashina's practice, but it's also meant to underscore the fact that this demographic is quite underrepresented historically in the field of ceramics. So this is the work of Pattie Warashina. The one on the left is the Mount's collection. It's called Golden Kiln. The one on the right, I believe, is at the Smithsonian, and it's called Car Kiln. And Warashina in the 70s started making this kind of work, which is a reference to the kiln, which is the oven where you fire clay, ceramics. And she was actually using it to critique the macho culture that was sort of, I mean, it's a rumor, it's something that a lot of people say from that time, that the ceramics departments at universities were very sort of male driven, even though there was plenty of successful female artists that came out of them. But Pattie was specifically concerned about the kiln building process. And Natalia actually got to talk to her, and she told her that women were actually physically left out of that process of building these kilns. And so that's why she created this series in which she was taking sort of muscle classic cars and turning them into kilns, because the kilns at universities are usually called car kilns, these sort of big kilns that are used. And so I actually think Pattie got kind of far in how she could use humor to be critical, to have a critical lens, to take maybe something personal and make it into a more broader topic that other people could relate to. And in this case, it was an issue, a feminist issue. I'll go on to Woody the Othello now. He is actually based in the Bay Area. He moved there in order to sort of be in relationship with Arneson and Volkos and Fry and every other ceramic artist in California. And it makes sense. He was born to a Haitian family. He was raised in Miami. And definitely his work has complete relevance in terms of his relationship to Arneson. And I'll say here, I brought the Arneson back because I think there's a clear sort of connection in the sense that Woody is taking everyday items, just anything that you'd find around the house, and he's twisting them and sort of playing with the scales of the object, and making them really human. It's actually, Woody's work is the only work in the show that doesn't have some type of figure in it, some type of eyes. But actually there's something really psychological about the work that is really successful. I'll talk about this one, Outward and Outbound. It's clearly a faucet of some kind. And something that Woody does is he uses these sort of sensual glazes to his work. There's just these really beautiful surfaces usually that sort of hide the darker undertones of the work. His work is very much, when you look at the sculptures, they have a sense of exhaustion to them. There's always something going on with them internally, in a sense. And in this case, there's this faucet, there's twists and knots on it. Even though, sorry, there's a helicopter going by. Even though it's not actually a faucet, what the functionality of the faucet would be is completely, it's rendered null because of these twists. If there's no water that could come out of it. And when I think of it as sort of anxiety and feeling powerless and not being able to do something. And I think what's really successful about what he's doing, not using anthropomorphism in the way of a face, is that he's actually creating a very sort of democratic body of work in which anybody can relate to it without feeling some type of, I don't know, discrimination in a sense. If this was a person, maybe you would say, oh, that's not me. But in this sense, because it's an object, then anybody can feel related to it. So that's that work. Outlet. By the way, I know this image it's hard to tell how big it is, but it's pretty big. Like, you know, we're used to an outlet this big, and it's a big sculpture, and that's what I mean with scale. And this one, very specifically, I see as a body sort of dragging itself across the floor. Like, there's a clear sense of exhaustion that comes from powering other objects, because that's, you know, an outlet powers things. But actually that sense of exhaustion comes from basically being Black in the United States. Woody is a young Black man, and he is often inspired by sort of the daily indignities faced by Black people in the United States, and the just sort of tragic history of violence, and not only in the United States, also in the Caribbean, since his family is Haitian. And so, you know, you can imagine this as a body who spends time sort of taking care of others to then sort of being tossed aside. And so, yeah, it's a direct commentary to the sort of violence and abuse towards Black bodies historically. But I'll say this, but Woody still hopes that the humor in the work will help sort of ease trauma, maybe help process trauma. So that's what he makes the work, how he makes it. Then we have the work of Yvette Mayorga, who's a Mexican-American artist based in Chicago. And I'll note that I included this painting by her because she works in ceramics and painting, but her paintings still have sort of a ceramic subject to it. And I wanted to show in the exhibition also sort of ceramics as an expanded field. So ceramics as a subject and ceramics as a complement to other mediums, not just as object-based. And so this work right here, Vase Century, is actually directly referencing this object on the right, which is, I believe this one's part of the Brooklyn Museum collection. And it's a century vase. It was an object created to commemorate 100 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So it's a celebratory object. And Yvette actually often references upper white, upper class objects, so that she can sort of she takes the form, she takes the concept, but she changes the content altogether. It keeps some of the symbolism, it keeps some of the power, but it completely sort of turns it on its head. And that's what she did in this painting. So in this painting, that central medallion has been, so you have Washington on the right. She has replaced that with an image of Latinx immigrants sort of climbing the current US-Mexico border fence, which this is what she's interested in. She's interested in the idea of the American dream, but coming very specifically from the Latinx immigrant imagination. So she's critical of it in the sense of like, she thinks that, you know, immigrants think that the United States is gonna be so much better. But once they get here, they encounter a lot of prejudice, and of course, there's systemic racism that affects them. So that's what's in the center. Around the medallion is a bunch of sort of consumer goods. Yvette describes the United States as a consumerist candy land. And you can see that also in sort of the confectionery quality to her work. Which is also meant to reference the sort of gendered jobs that immigrants, Latinx immigrants take up when they get to the United States, from construction to baking. So there's that. And then also part of the reason why she picked this object is to say that this is also part of the United States history. Often, you know, it gets left out, but this is also in a sense that it's not necessarily a good thing, but it's something that should be recognized as part of the history of the United States. We have this work called Alligator Boots as well. And this one is directly inspired by the idea of 16th century banquet culture in Europe, in which sugar sculptures were placed at the center of the table, and they were basically conversation pieces. They were sort of diplomatic and somewhat nuanced political commentary. And so she's taken that idea and then turned it into the ceramic sculpture. And this one, it has the American dream at the center. It's this brown-skinned woman. You can't see it in this image, but she's wearing these sort of indigenous boots, leather boots, like they kind of look like cowboy boots. And she has the American flag sort of draped over her. And she's sort of overseeing this kind of chaotic scene in which there are a bunch of figures. Some are sort of awaiting to take on the American dream, so, you know, to cross and make it to the United States, while others have already been sort of negatively affected by it. There's a figure, if you see the dark blue here at the bottom, that is a figure that has been drowned by the weight of their dreams. This is an image of a sketch for one of those sugar sculptures from the 16th century. And then finally, for Yvette's sort of section, there's the sculpture of Nike Cortez shoes. They're called killer shoes. That's how she called them, because the irony is not lost on her. These shoes, for those who don't know, are a very popular style of Nike sneakers. And originally they were actually called Aztec. And then at some point they decided to change the name to Cortez. So they quite literally took the power from the Aztec Empire to give it to the colonizer who's responsible for the demise of the Aztec Empire. And actually, it's a very popular shoe with Latinx gangs across the United States, especially Los Angeles. So it's rather ironic, especially it's called Killer Shoes. So there's a reference to the violence of colonization, but also sort of the continuous cycle of violence in the United States. And then this is another view of the show. So you can see we're kind of moving along the space. We also have the work of Maryam Yousif. And Maryam was born in Iraq. She now lives in Chicago as well. And she created this piece right here. It's called Puabi Palm's Pot. And she created it as part of this series in which she was recreating the objects of Puabi's tomb. And Puabi was a Sumerian queen who was said to have ruled about 3,000 years ago on her own in what is now modern day Iraq. And so basically, I actually don't remember how long ago, but like decades ago, a British archaeologist came in, found the tomb, and all the objects were basically distributed between different museums in England and the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Very, very few items remain in Iraq. And so in a sense, just kind of like how Natalia sort of creates these objects that try to trace back her lineage back to her ancestors. So Maryam is doing the same thing by recreating these objects, by sort of reinterpreting these objects. And I think it also works as a type of repatriation for the objects that, of course, are still in other places that are not Iraq. And she's also working to connect all sort of her female role models throughout history. So that includes her mom and her grandmother, pop stars and pan-Arab pop stars, and then all the way back to this queen. And she was, here's Puabi Palm Spot, a better view. She was really inspired by funk ceramics. She used to live in the Bay Area, and while she was there, that was just really influential in the way she was making art. And you can see that in the way she's sort of making these like faces. And this pot is very sort of reminiscent, I think, of the landscape in Iraq. You sort of get the sandy color and the palm trees. But Puabi, in a sense, is inhabiting this body. Then we have the work of Salvador Jimenez-Flores, who was born in Mexico. He is also Chicago-based. There's a lot of Chicago artists in the show. Who is making this work. You can see it's a stack, it's a cactus. And he has this ongoing series of these works. They're called La Resistencia de los Nopales Híbridos, or the resistance of the hybrid cacti. And what he's doing with this is, well, he's doing many things, but he's basically making a parallel between the sort of resilience of the Latinx community in the United States with a cactus, which of course cacti live in very harsh environments and they thrive. And in a similar way, the Latinx community is thriving in the United States despite systemic oppression, despite whatever might come their way, especially when you think about it in the still current administration. There's been a lot of sort of slander that has come towards the Latinx community. And also there's just been a lot of sort of terrible things happening at the border. So this is from 2016 and sadly remains completely relevant. He is referencing a bunch of different things, like from his sort of home. There's the what you see that's golden. It's sort of a figure that's supposed to resemble Huitzilopochtli, who was the main god of the Aztecs. But you also have sort of a fist at the bottom, which comes from the Black Power fist. So it's just a sort of like resistance and power. He's drawing a lot of sort of information from Afrofuturism and the idea of hopefully helping brown people make it into the future in art and just in general, just ensuring their survival. And I will say also that this guy right here, that's actually Salvador, like that's his face. And his tongue actually has like a tattoo that says, never underestimate an American. And he has little sort of messages all throughout these sculptures that are meant to sort of empower people, especially anybody who was not, I guess, born in the United States, because there's a lot of issues around that in terms of immigration and who gets to be an American and how you survive in the United States. But that comes, of course, directly from Robert Arneson, who was very much about the self-portrait, as I mentioned before. Salvador is also very influenced by funk ceramics quite directly, because that's another thing. Some artists very specifically know funk history and they will, cite it and quote it and reference it, while others are doing it in a much more subtle way, in more unconscious way. Finally, we have Diana Yesenia Alvarado, who is a Latinx artist based here in LA, which is where I am right now. And I think her work has a lot to do with sort of love and the sort of need for it and the right to it. So we have these two little figures that I think of as Mickey and Minnie Mouse, who are kissing, and there's what I find really important is the structure they're in. Here, you can see it better there, maybe. It's this security bars that are basically all over Los Angeles, and they're mostly used because of there's a lot of crime, and that's why the windows have them. But in this case, it's being used to sort of protect this idea of love, this sort of very charming and tender moment. And I think that's something that's really important about the work in the show too, which I think this piece really gets to. It's the idea that happiness and sadness are like dualities that coexist, and that kind of like influence each other. And a lot of what Diana's work is about is vulnerability and strength together. And so this work is called Smile Now, Cry Later. And to me, it was, the more that I worked on this show, the more powerful this piece became for me, because it reminded me that despite all the sort of intensity of what's going on in the world, everything 2020, 2021 now, which is just an extension of 2020, that we all need to find moments of joy and laughter and just moments to rest, just so that we can keep on going with the fight, with whatever, you know, it's coming your way. If you don't take a moment to sort of find this joy, then you can't really move forward. You won't have the strength to keep going. And I think that was something really important about this work. And I think, you know, it's something that especially POCs in the world need to like kind of live by, because it's just, life is not easy. And just kind of like making it through the day it's a small victory. And so especially making it through 2020 was very, very sort of big for everyone. But I think given the sort of Black Lives Matters protests that sort of happen everywhere and that will likely continue, it's important to just keep in mind to just have a moment to just breathe and find your joy before you get out there and keep fighting the good fight. And that's it. And whoops, sorry, I'll get out of here. Oh, well, I'll keep it in case Garth wants to talk about any specific slide. Hold on. I can't hear you, Garth.
Okay, so.
Oh, there now. I can hear you.
So Angelique, thank you so much. One of the things that I wanted to point out, Peter Seltz kind of took great pains not to over-define the funk movement, because I don't think you really can over-define it. But one of the things that was sort of an initial point about it was that funk is a hot medium rather than a cool medium. It is passionate and emotional and involved rather than being detached and formalist. And it really struck me while you were talking, particularly about the contemporary artists. You know, you are not a removed curator with her hair in a sort of bun, speaking in you know, sort of art history centric terms as you describe these pieces. You're sort of passionately getting into the muck, as it were, and talking about the artists and their social issues. So I think you're really honoring the spirit and the continuum of the work. But the first kind of question that I have that I'll have you help illuminate a little bit, I wanted to kind of point out, and this is something that I think you're noticing as well, is that there is this sort of generational discovery of the viscerality of clay. And we have an audience of Dec Arts nerds, you know who you are on the call. And with the history of decorative arts, there are always these pendulum swings between different styles and sort of what's important in decorative arts. And so it is with ceramics, but you can go all the way back to Gauguin in the late 1800s. He was working in clay, and he had this almost anthropomorphic idea of the clay being tortured in the kiln. And so when you look at the clay pieces that he did, they have this awkward quality that sort of echoes the fire. You know, Valley Wieseltier and the Wiener Werkstatt sort of was the first sculptural generation to really discover the direct modeling of the clay. And you can see fingerprints, and a lot of Wiener Werkstätte pieces look utterly contemporary to us today. You know, you fast forward to Arneson, and in the 60s, they rediscover sort of the power of, it strikes me as sort of in Arneson, it's an unsexy surface. Antonio Prieto, the Spanish-born artist and potter, was his teacher, and he certainly learned to use stoneware and make really rich surfaces. But I was actually wondering, while we have the pieces up here, if you could go back to like the Arneson typewriter and to almost any of the artists that you're choosing. I would say in particular, Yvette's work is a really great comparison. Can you help us to sort of read this surface and tell us what's rebellious and why this surface it goes beyond the sort of quick reading of it as like an amateur, unskilled surface? What are the artists trying to say?
I think like a few years ago, there was the whole sloppy craft thing going on. And I think artists, and there's artists that in a sense are still working in that. But I think a lot of artists decided to like make it a little tighter, but not tight in like not super tight in the sense of they still want sort of I think there's a sort of immediacy that you can see in the tactility of the work, like the way that you can see where, like in this one, you can see where she is putting the clay, you can see where she's scratching. There is, like you were saying, there's a sense like an emotional quality to it that is captured in the dynamism of the way that she's rendering the work. I do think it goes beyond. I do think you can describe it as a sort of like purposeful amateur aesthetic, because it is purposeful. She's choosing to make it look this way.
I think one other thing that people might not be able to necessarily get overtly from the slides is a sense of the material. So if you go back to the Robert Arneson, it's interesting that the funk artists started, and I apologize to everybody, I actually have an MFA in studio ceramics from Alfred. So I often think about the actual clay and the actual material when I'm considering things. But the funk artists sort of developed this aggressively awful clay called whiteware, and it's made primarily out of talc, and it is
lumpy.
It's lumpy. It is chalky. There is nothing, like if you think about porcelain and how vitrified and great of a material porcelain is, it's fragile, it's lumpy, it's chalky. It's kind of an aggressively unesthetic material in certain ways. And so when you look at this typewriter, you can kind of see that aesthetic at work here. And I think you can look across a lot of the artists. Natalia and Woody are somewhat outliers, and Salvador, I guess, somewhat in that they're choosing clay that, Natalia's choosing earthenware clay that has links to, Colombian, like indigenous clay. But I think if you'd like to choose almost any of the artists and kind of talk about the actual clay choice and material choice and how that works into the meaning.
Yeah, I think this work right here by Yvette, it's porcelain. And of course, porcelain has this sort of extremely charged history when you think about how, Europeans kind of went mad trying to get it. And then porcelain was also involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It was something that came about and ultimately in different ways, it just influenced so much pottery production throughout the world because just everyone wanted to have porcelain. But I think something for this one, and you can see the cracks that have happened in this work. I think it just kind of denotes the fragility of this material, that just like how you think of porcelain as something like really pristine and something just really beautiful, but actually because of this charged history it has, is actually sort of kind of a terrible material when you think about it. I think that's something that Yvette is trying to demonstrate when she's choosing to work with porcelain, because she doesn't always use porcelain. So in this case, it does have a significance to use porcelain over terracotta and just glazing it white. So I think there is definitely a difference to that. But I was going to say, when you were talking about sort of the lumpy quality of the material that the funk artists were using, I think, sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought here. But there was something, that they were really interested in sort of breaking down the pretensions of the time, I think, and that's why they were choosing to use basically a material that nobody else would want to work with. And so they were choosing just kind of like children wouldn't want to work with this material. And then they were making work out of it and sort of just fighting with the pretensions of the art world and even the craft world, because that's not what craft was at the time either.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just got finished reading Everything She Touched, which is the biography of Ruth Asawa. And, I'm not a Bay Area person, and I didn't realize the extent to which she was working with public art. And she would do these big bronze fountains with mermaids and all of these happy, lumpy, like very funk figures. And she was actually using salt dough that kids would work with as her material, and then taking it to the bronze foundry and paying $1 billion to have it cast.
That's pretty awesome.
You could really almost include Ruth Asawa, of all people, in all of her sort of minimalist fiber wire glory in the funk movement as well.
That's really cool. I don't know that. I'm gonna have to get that book.
I highly recommend it.
Salt dough was kind of a thing at that time too, which is kind of amazing.
So your last statement is sort of a perfect lead-in for my next question. And I would make the statement that ceramics is an outsider material in a lot of ways. I think because of the sort of dichotomy between fine art and the decorative arts, ceramics has sort of found itself on the outside looking in when it comes to the art world. That's a discussion that I'm not like that excited to have right now, but particularly all of the funk artists were coming to the medium with like a real sense of exclusion in a way. And Robert Arneson was actually kind of obsessed with ads from commercial clay companies. Ceramics really came into its own in the 1950s and early 60s as a hobby. And Duncan Ceramics had the
world's most fascinating hobby. That's what Arneson said.
Indeed. So yeah, that was a Duncan advertising slogan, ceramics, the world's most fascinating hobby. And so Arneson adopts this, and it's a real tongue-in-cheek thing, because he's like, he really aspired to be in the fine art world, but it was an element of self-mocking that he was sort of invoking all of these craft things. And so I think here we are, back in the year 2020, and a lot of the artists that you're showing, and I think that your critique of the sort of whiteness and maleness of funk is absolutely a valid one. But at the same time, I think all of those artists were expressing a sense of outsiderness. So here we are in 2020, and this group of artists is using clay as a way to kind of express their identity and being on the outside looking in, even as ceramics has sort of become a cool kid medium, because Seth Rogen,
it's the coolest now.
Yeah, Seth Rogen is like getting studio visits from like all of my friends right now and giving them pots.
No, I definitely think that that's the main connection. It's this feeling of being outsider, even though in very different ways, as you've stated. It's like, yeah, like, Arneson had this like I feel like it was like a push-pull thing in which I think he was trying to protect himself in a way by like being self-deprecating and saying like, basically saying like, oh yeah, I just do this hobby thing. Even though he had a very serious practice. So it was both, he was trying to pretend like he didn't have a serious practice, even though he did. But a lot of the work he was making was just constantly just trying to prove, I think, the worth of the material. And then now we're at a time in which that's not even necessary anymore. You know, like I think artists are pretty confident in choosing to use clay because we're just in a different world for I don't know if for better or for worse. Clay has become rather mainstream in the art world, and so yeah. And so then when we talk about these artists, they're past that. They use clay because they like clay, and sometimes because there's specific meanings, such as when we talked about this porcelain, or when we talk about Natalia's work, in which what clay she's using has a very specific meaning. But ultimately, it's just a material that they choose to use to convey a narrative.
So I want to ask one final question before we take some questions from the audience, and a few people have sent in some questions beforehand. So if you have questions, make sure that you ask them in the text panel. But I'm going to put actually a link to the Center for Crafts website. And I want to encourage everybody to go to the Center for Crafts website, and you can actually purchase an ebook of Angelik's really great—
or the physical copy, if that's what you prefer.
Copy. But Angelik did a terrific essay that really, if you're liking what you're hearing here and you feel like you want to pick up more, Angelik did a really good job of contextualizing this kind of historically. So you can access it via the link that I just put in the text.
Thanks,
yeah, the final thing I want to ask you, Angelik, before we take questions is just to overtly talk about the decorative arts. I think we've got a group of artists, almost all of the artists in some way are referencing domestic objects in some way. And that ties right into, you know, decorative arts.
I don't know if you had a specific question there, but I will say that, I mean, I come from a Dec Arts background. That's what I did my master's in. And originally I was studying European porcelain, basically. It's sort of my initial background. I think there's something really interesting. To me, craft kind of picks up the mantle to when kind of Dec Arts kind of stop being produced in the same way. Like, I think like, I don't know that there's like a specific cutoff, but I think at some point it's just like whatever Dec Arts was then became craft. And then craft then became this other thing, like craft with a capital C, which is what it's, you know, connects to the art world. It's craft that like sort of blends into the art world. So it's, I feel like there's this just sort of flow to it. But when you think of, I mean, I clearly like Yvette's work directly references very sort of classic Dec art objects. And ultimately, these are objects. I just think they function differently in the sense that they don't have a function. I think a lot of Dec arts have a function. You expect them to be in the home, and they have a function in the home, even though they tend to be like really beautiful objects, really like beautiful crafted objects. But it's interesting because a lot of these objects, you know, end up back in a home in a sense. So it's just like, it's like a cycle of sort of meaning there. But I honestly just don't think there's that much of a difference between Dec Arts and craft and art. It just all goes together.
Yeah, I think we did a little bit of talking ahead of time, and I think Angelik and I both kind of share a mission in when an artist considers themselves, you know, who uses clay art with a capital A, I'm usually trying to read craft into what they're doing. And when an artist like considers themselves sort of purely within the craft realm, I think my intuition usually is to kind of build it up and connect it with fine art traditions too. So it's a spectrum that I think is really fun to get in the middle of sort of muddying.
Yeah, I think we're trying to break down the sort of taboo with craft. We're like, let's be done with that. You know, like for years, for decades, there's just been this issue with the word craft, and it's just like, let's get rid of that. It's fine. It's fine. We're good. Craft is awesome.
All right, so we've got a few questions and comments that have come through. So Ron Barron, I'm so happy. Ron, I think, came along as someone who really influenced me very young in my career. I met him when he was in grad school, and he points out very rightly that funk artists are using this nasty whiteware because color works really well with it. Mm-hmm. It actually is a material that resists cracking as well. So artists could work really quickly with it, and it was forgiving when it came to the drying process. And you could work kind of big with it as well, but it is nasty when you pick up
Not everyone loved it.
And look at it.
Yeah.
Like it is so chalky on the bottom and so breakable.
Sandra hated it. Sandra Shannonhouse hated it. She did not like that material at all, and that's why she switched to porcelain eventually. So not everybody liked it.
No, indeed. And it's interesting that, you know, Arneson evolves toward working in sort of more sort of materially sensitive ways, I think, as his career went along. So someone who doesn't want to be named, who signed in anonymously, asks also a really great question. And I have something that I want to sort of answer to it as well. They asked, do you know of any artists who rejected being labeled funk in the 60s, but embraced being part of the movement later in their lives and careers, or vice versa? And Angelique, I'll let you.
No, I'll let you. You go first.
So that's a really interesting question. And one thing that I wanted to respond to when you were talking as well, Angelique, is that you know, you say that you kind of reject calling funk a movement, and I think that's super fair, but the word spreads like wildfire. And I think people in the Midwest, you know, it's largely a West Coast phenomenon, but one of the things that I've actually kind of been looking into over the last 5 or 6 years is like the conduit for, you know, why did it become such, in the ceramics world, it becomes not an epithet really, it becomes just a matter-of-fact label. And I can, you know, really tell you for sure that by 1966, the Everson has a bunch of work from the 1966 Ceramic National. And before the funk show happened, there was definitely a revolution across the country of artists working in a sort of gnarlier, more visceral way. And it didn't necessarily have a name, but once funk came along, it had a name. And there were, I really desperately want to curate a show called Prairie Funk that has a selection of artists from the Midwest, and particularly going all the way up to Canada. There were some great Canadian funk artists like Victor Sikansky, who actually was a student of Arneson and came back. But rejecting being labeled funk and then sort of being part of the movement. Clayton Bailey, who you mentioned, and I'm so happy that you did, is kind of a great example of this. He was actually a core of the group of artists that, and they created the term nut art to be an artist-generated movement rather than something that was applied from the outside. But he actually, when he was teaching in South Dakota before moving to the Bay Area, created a South Dakota Funk Festival in Vermilion, South Dakota. And he brought out, I think, David Gahuli and Maya Peoples-Bright, and had this crazy festival where he had his students making nutty stuff. And I think he didn't necessarily embrace the term funk, but certainly I think kept the spirit and kept the sort of comic book poking lowbrow humor as a part of his work, you know, kind of throughout his entire life. It's interesting to see artists from the 1980s who embrace some kind of funk aesthetics without sort of labeling themselves as such. I don't know. Do you have any other?
Oh, I can't think of anyone. I think most of the people that were like in the Funk 1967 show, like, and I'm not thinking ceramics, I'm thinking just artists in general, kind of just became a name on their own, and they never kind of looked back. And thinking of it wasn't Bruce Newman in that show.
Yeah.
And I don't know that he ever really said, oh yeah, funk. Yeah, I don't know. I think ultimately it was either you liked it or you didn't like it, and you ran with it.
And I'm obsessed with this generational swing, and it's interesting that I went to grad school starting in 1998, and I graduated in 2000, and that's a period in which industrial design and slickness, I think, absolutely ruled the ceramic world, and technology was emerging. And I feel like students at that time were absolutely allergic to looking at funk art. And so that actually forced me to kind of strike up a friendship with David Gilhooly and a correspondence with him. And Gilhooly was kind of selling off, he would periodically kind of make a break with clay and sell off his.
I mean, he made a lot of sculptures, like a lot.
So prolific. But I was buying, I on the early days of eBay, I was buying some of his like ceramic souvenirs and things that he had amassed. Like I have a pile of his postcards that Robert Arneson wrote to him, and I was able to buy them, you know, for no money back in the 1990s, when I think those type things would be incredibly hot items, because there is this like, you know, emerging re-interest in funk. And no one was interested in David Gilhooly in particular in the 1990s. I will qualify that a little bit. His prices were incredibly low. Some collectors were, you know, still carrying the torch, but I think there's, I can almost guarantee that some young curator, maybe me, will put together a major Gilhooly retrospective in the next decade, and he will get sort of a long needed critical reevaluation.
Yes, he's awesome. And you can see him here in this picture, and he's actually wearing a shirt. I'm gonna guess he probably designed this shirt because it has little frogs and like hula skirts.
Yeah, he did some really famous residencies at the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia, and they really enabled him and some other artists to do things. And so, yeah, Jun Kaneko did a great residency there, but he was able to come away with all sorts of fabrics. And at some point you could really find them on eBay, but I have not seen David Gilhooly fabric or his t-shirts for a long time, because I think they're so scarce at the moment.
Coming off this, it's sort of like a side note. I've had many contemporary artists have a very adverse reaction to the mention of funk. So there are people that just, I can't quite understand why they have such distaste for it, but they do. So I just feel like a very, it's a love or hate it with funk. I think it goes for everyone, for scholars, for artists, for just general audience.
Yeah, and I think that I would encourage, I would be very interested. The comments are not flowing from everybody right now, but I always like to encourage people to dig deeper past their initial visceral reaction.
That's
part
of what funk is. They wanted a visceral reaction.
Absolutely. Let's point people, I guess, to some other resources. You did some really great archival digging when you were doing this.
You can kind of see them here. There's a really great book on Robert Arneson called A Troublesome Subject.
Yes.
And there is, I mean, you can find the catalog, the funk catalog, which there's just one essay by Peter Sells, but it really illuminates the sort of vagueness around funk. There's also, what is it? Humor, wit, and, sorry, I have it right here. Humor, irony, and wit, ceramic funk from the 60s and beyond, which is this catalog from Arizona or ASU.
Peter Hill.
Yeah. And then, What Nerve is a really good book too.
Yeah. So that's the one that I wanted to point out to people. There's an amazing catalog called What Nerve that originated at the RISD Art Museum, I believe. And it dealt with the Harry Who and other artist groups that are kind of outside of the mainstream. I highly recommend that.
Of the 1967 exhibition.
Incredible.
And this is the typewriter right here.
Oh, you'll have to talk while you show it so that people can see it.
Okay, there it is right there.
And then one of the final things that I will say is that one of the great things about the Berkeley Art Museum is that it was lodged on a campus. And so there was a broadcast studio and a filmmaking school. So there is actually like a little weird, I don't know, pot-laced documentary called The Funk Art Film. And you can see chunks of it on YouTube if you go to YouTube and look up The Funk Art Film. And you can see a little sort of interview with Gilhooly, and you can see Arneson driving his sort of suburban dad car around as well. There was a question that came in, and Nora Lavory asked if you can talk a little bit more about Yvette in particular, and her interest in Maiolica and the sugar sculptures. And you are very correct, Nora, in saying that Maiolica can be very funky. It allows like a certain type of drawing and surface that I think is incredible.
Yeah, I don't know that, I mean, there is definitely a glaze on this porcelain here, but I don't know that she typically uses Maiolica, but there is something very fun about Maiolica for sure. And I'll say that the Bard Graduate Center did a project on Maiolica and drag that is really awesome. But I will say in terms of the confectionery, she's actually using like pipe bags to make the work. And she's just really thinking, well, two things. She's thinking about sort of this sweetness and sort of innocence that comes from something that looks like a cake. You're not going to think anything serious is happening there. So you'll probably get really close and try to see what's there. And then you kind of get confronted by scenes like this. Sometimes there's sort of more serious scenes like an ice raid or I'm trying to think, but ice raids are pretty typical in her work. And I mean like immigration, ice. But she is thinking about what I said before is this gendered roles that many Latinx immigrants take up. And there's a lot of like candy making and baking and construction working. So that's what she's also applying it so like sort of thickly. But I will also note, there's gonna be a program. I have a program with her, upcoming program on January 21st. So I'll tell you here, January 21st, in which Yvette will be decorating a cake while we talk. So if you're interested in knowing more about her work, you should join us for that program. It's with the Center for Craft. And she will be talking all about her practice, and we'll definitely talk a lot about her choice of materials while she's making a sort of protest cake, which is very, very appropriate right after the inauguration.
Angelique, that's a perfect transition as well. Carrie promised us that we would have sort of full reign over Plugola for the projects that we're working on at the end of this. Can you talk a little bit more about any upcoming exhibitions at MAD or?
Yeah. Okay, so here, I'll go here this May. At MAD, we're putting together a permanent collection show. We're just highlighting, we're doing like little vignettes from our collection. And of course, I chose to do one on funk ceramics or funk artists, not necessarily. We don't have specifically work from that time, but we do have work by those artists. And so that there will be a section at the museum that will talk about funk ceramics, and you'll get to see the work in person. So that's really exciting. And then the other program I wanted to plug is January 14th. Garth will join me again, along with Salvador and Natalia at the Center for Craft, to just talk more about the show and talk more about funk and humor and just all the things.
And I want to take a second to plug Angelik's catalog even further. I got to read a digital copy, and I must say it is excellent and definitely worth adding to your library, especially if you're new to craft. It's always a really amazing, it's amazing to see somebody write eloquently and poignantly about these objects. So I highly recommend it. And Garth also has an exciting opportunity that everyone needs to register for.
Yes, absolutely. So I will mention that as soon as the pandemic came down, so the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, if you're not familiar with it, is really sort of the bedrock of studio ceramics in the United States. From 1932 on, we hosted the Ceramic Nationals, and the Everson has the entire collection of the Ceramic Nationals. We are also the home of Adelaide Robineau's Scarab Vase. So if you haven't made a pilgrimage to come and visit the most famous pot in America, I encourage you to do so. The Everson is open and safe, and we would love to open our doors to you. But since the pandemic started, we've been doing monthly programs, object study sessions, such as this one, where we invite in artists. But we've also gotten a little bit frisky as well in our pandemic programming. I've had the good fortune of partnering with the American Wine Association on a couple of virtual wine tastings. And on the same day that Angelik is hosting the cake baking talk, we are going to be hosting a virtual Scotch tasting. So we are partnering with Balvenie Whiskey, and they are providing sort of their East Coast rep to us. And we're going to have some actual bottles of Balvenie here in Syracuse. But if you pick up a bottle of Balvenie, you can actually register and do the tasting along with us. That's going to be the day after inauguration. So
you can, I don't know if they're at the same time, but you can choose either for the booze or for the cake. Hey, everybody has their guilty pleasure.
So I think we're at 6 p.m. Central. So I think we had established that they were at
time, but I'm not sure.
So double your pleasure and double your fun.
I am looking forward to it. And thank you both so much for an hour and 20-minute escape today. I think we all greatly appreciate taking a pause from everything that's going on, and it helps us to remember why all of what we do is so important, even though it is fun and funny. So thank you both very much. And I would be remiss if I did not also plug our upcoming Americana Week, which will be, there you go, happening January 19th, 20th, and 21st. We have a series of different tours. So please, if you have not yet, go onto the Decorative Arts Trust website and register for those today. Garth and Angelik. Yes, we will be talking about that vase, the Century vase at the Brooklyn Museum. So more ceramics always, all the time. So thank you both so much, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
See you all soon. All right, bye.
Thank you.